1977, Hugh Heclo wrote a very interesting book called The Government of Strangers. And he pointed out in this book the tensions between the bureaucrats and the political appointees. Problem not solved, you might know, but nevertheless, he identified in this book a new type of actor on the scene in Washington. People like James Schlesinger, Michael Blumenthal, who was, I keep forgetting, that's right, you're not as old as I am. Blumenthal was Secretary of the Treasury, Schlesinger, Energy for Carter, Ray Marshall in Labor, and in later ministers, people like George Shultz. And what these people had done was, for Heckel, they had this ability to move between the private and the public sector into academia. So, for example, Schlesinger taught economics at the University of Virginia, was Secretary of Energy, head of the Rand Corporation. Michael Blumenthal taught economics at Princeton, was Secretary of Treasury, CEO of Bendix, and of course George Shultz, all the jobs he's held, Dean at Chicago, Stanford, and so on. And the idea was that this set of people who could move freely between the private and the public sector, that these set of people were the kind of management types that could actually resolve this sort of difficulty. And in fact, one claim he made in this book is that you could move across partisan bounds. So Schlesinger was both in the Nixon administration and the Carter administration. The partisan ability may have fallen off in the last decade or so, but it's certainly true that there are people who can move freely, and we're quite lucky today to have a panel of 3 people who have been able to move quite successfully between these sectors. So I'm going to introduce them briefly in order, alphabetical order. So first, Kathleen Brown, Treasurer of the State of California, gubernatorial candidate. She was the chair of the Presidential Commission on Capital Budgeting. She's a member of the Los Angeles Unified School District. She was an attorney in the private sector, attorney of the Capital Markets Group with the law firm of Melvin and Myers. Investment Management Group, Bank of America. Until 2003, she was with Goldman Sachs Private Wealth Management. And now she is the head of public finance of the West region for Goldman Sachs. So obviously a career in which you can move. Next on the list is Bob Grady. And I should say that I first met Bob the very first day I ever taught a class at the business school. I was teaching a class on Japanese political economy. Bob walked in with several of his friends, sat in the back row for about 5 minutes, and then left, and never returned. But after that, we still managed to maintain friendship. Bob's a graduate of Harvard, where he wrote on the Crimson, and then after that, he was involved in politics with Wilson Fenwick, Governor Tom Keene, came to the business school. After the business school in '88, he worked in the Bush campaign, and then was deputy director of OMB in Bush 1, or Bush Pair, in case we have foreigners. And then after that, he worked for Robertson Stevens, and now is the managing partner in Carlyle Group in San Francisco. Kevin Warsh, I had a slightly different experience. Kevin's a Stanford grad and a Harvard law grad. Kevin, my first experience was Kevin in 1987. I had a senior seminar that was economists and political economists, and a freshman from Albany, New York, tried to wedge his way in the course. And at the end of 2 hours, I finally let him in because he wouldn't go away. And he got the highest grade in the course. So I've always thought that was the highlight of his career. But seriously, Kevin has done what he graduated from Harvard Law School. Worked in mergers and acquisition at Morgan Stanley, and now is a special assistant, special advisor to the president on economic policy. So you see we have a panel that covers all of this very well. Now what you don't know, and what the panel does know, is we have 5 questions that they've all received in order. So what the procedure here is, we're going to ask these questions in order, they'll comment on them, and then when we're done with the 5th question, we'll get to, we'll try and get to your questions as soon as possible. So we're going to start with Bob Grady, and Bob, you could kind of sketch out in a little more detail the public and private aspects of your career.
Well, as Dave mentioned, I actually, my sort of personal algorithm was I started in the public sector right out of college, and then over time migrated to the private sector and stay involved in both political and nonprofit activities kind of as a hobby. But my first job out of college was going to work for my hometown congresswoman, and that was the name Dave mentioned, Millicent Fenwick, who was a sort of moderate Republican congresswoman from New Jersey. If any of you read Doonesbury, the comic strip, she was the character on whom Lacey Davenport was modeled. She kind of called everybody dear and smoked a pipe, and was a really interesting character. We actually ran for the Senate when I was her chief of staff back a long time ago in 1982, and lost to Frank Lautenberg, who still sits in the Senate to this day. We were outspent 12-1, as I was telling Kathleen in the warm-up, so that's a whole topic we can get into, finance of campaigns. But anyway, after we lost, I went to work as the director of communications and then the chief of staff to Tom Kean, who was the governor of New Jersey in those days, in the mid-'80s, and ran with a friend his campaign for re-election, which we won by a big number, so that was good. And after that, had decided that I wanted a career, such as Dave describes, going back and forth between public and private sector. So I decided to go to business school, and had applied and decided to come out here. And actually got a call as I was preparing to leave, because it was in the newspapers that I was leaving, because we'd done a good job in the campaign, from then Vice President Bush, and ended up going to the White House for a year and being a speechwriter for the Vice President. Then came to the GSB, went to Wall Street for a little bit, and then when I was a little bit after that, he was running for president in '88, so I went to run the speechwriting on the campaign, which was wonderful and fun and hilarious. Travel around on the plane for a year and see the country. It's a good way to travel if you can. And then when we won, having had a little bit of a finance background and having secured an MBA, I didn't really want to sort of be a PR flack for my whole life, so I didn't want to be the head speechwriter in the White House, so I purposely took a policy job, first as associate director and then as the deputy director of OMB. And that's sort of the policy arm of the White House, where you very active, not only overseeing the budget, but some of the promulgation of regulations and, just a lot of the sort of substantive policy decisions that various agencies make. In my case, for the first couple of years there, I was in charge of the natural resources, energy, and science portfolio. So I had the whole R&D budget of the federal government, which was an interesting and fun thing to try to allocate. I was sort of had oversight over EPA and the Department of Energy and Department of Agriculture and Interior. Anyway, and then my last year in the White House, Secretary Baker, Jim Baker, who was the United States Secretary of State, came back to be the White House Chief of Staff and try to salvage the '92 election. And we lost. And I went over to the West Wing as his deputy, but we lost. Anyway, so I came out here in the beginning of 1993 and started teaching, actually, at the Stanford Business School. I've taught a course here for 10 of the last 12 years called Investing in Highly Regulated Industries. It started as a course really about how environmental laws and regulations work, and then I changed it over time to sort of mirror my own interests. And I went to work, and we could talk about how you think about these choices, but I went to work at what was then a relatively small and emerging growth-focused investment bank called Robertson Stevens. That our core business was underwriting IPOs and serving as M&A advisors for high-growth technology and healthcare companies. And the early 90s was a good time to get into the technology business, so we had a good little run there. And we actually sold the business in 1997 and then bought it back and sold it again in 1998. Teach a little finance course about that. And I left in April of 2000 and came to Carlyle. And Carlyle's in the private equity business. I run our venture capital business, where we invest pre-IPO in high technology and medical device companies. And as I mentioned, and I think this is one of the things to talk about, I have tried to keep a foot in nonprofit and public sector activities. So I sit on the board of some nonprofits, Environmental Defense, which is an environmental advocacy group, Resources for the Future, which is a think tank that does research on economics related to natural resources and economics, and stay involved in campaigns, served on Governor Schwarzenegger's campaign and then transition team, and was the co-chair in 04 of George W. Bush, and in 00 of George W. Bush's losing effort twice in California. But so I do that as a hobby now, not as a living. So it's a lot of fun.
Kathleen.
Well, I think I have the most nonlinear path between the private sector and the public sector. As a sophomore student at Stanford, having grown up in a political family with my father being governor, I was committed to never, ever enter politics or public life. So in my sophomore year at Stanford, I entered what I lovingly call the Witness Protection Program, got married, gave up the name Brown for Rice, and started a family, followed my then husband to Cambridge, where he was at Harvard Law School, and was never going to be involved in politics. Well, fast forward, 3 children later, moving back to California, having 3 kids in the public schools, and getting extremely frustrated with the bureaucracy of the Los Angeles Unified School District, and having appeared and made and having implored the school board on various initiatives, mostly schools of choice, the precursor really to charter schools, a genetic defect manifested itself, and rather than running for the PTA or getting involved in some district-wide committee, I said, I'm running for that Board of Education and try and shake things up. And so my first elective office was to the LA Unified School District Board, and it was really an action of passion, which is a little bit of a theme that I want to strike for you as you think about your careers. Be passionate about what you're doing, because whether it's in business and the hours you're going to be working, or politics and the hours you'll be working, and the public shame and humiliation and difficulty you'll face, you've got to be passionate about what it is you're doing in order to prevail, survive, pick yourself up, and go the next step. And secondly, in this nonlinear path, with a personal change in life circumstances and a divorce, and then sometime later a remarriage, I gave up my political career and resigned from the Board of Education and followed, again, my man, now my husband of 25 years, to New York City, and he was then president of CBS Sports and then CBS News, and I figured I would never, ever be in politics again. I mean, I wrote my letters to my supporters, and open letter in the newspaper, couldn't be a bicoastal board member and couldn't be a bicoastal, spouse, so off I went to New York and went from political life to corporate wife. And that was good for 2 years, especially when my husband was going to great sporting events all over the country. Though I wasn't interested in the sports at all. It was the hospitality parties that I liked. I guess the politician was in me even then. And I decided, with this kind of time-out intermission in my life and career, that I would go do something that I had wanted to do when I was at Stanford, which was go to law school. So I entered law school at age 37, graduated at 40, and started the law career that was referenced in my introduction. Learned very quickly that law was not what my father, uncles, ex-husband, brother-in-laws had made it out to be, but did it for 2 years, 2 weeks, 2 days, and when Tom Bradley, then mayor of Los Angeles, called me and asked me if I would join his administration as the Commissioner of Public Works and run the department that was in charge of sewers, sludge, and solid waste, I resisted for maybe 20 minutes and asked him a lot of mindless questions just so that I didn't accept too quickly and look too eager. But I accepted that job and went back into the public arena as a political appointee, which is very different than being an elected official, which we can talk about if you like. But I always like to say that as the queen of the sewers, I learned more about politics and life in those 2 years than, it stood me in good stead for life. I then, I didn't think I'd ever go back into politics, as I said, but people would come to me and say, why don't you run for this? Why don't you run for that? And I said, no, I'm loving what I'm doing. And then, lo and behold, Big Daddy of California politics, Jess Unruh, died in office, and the office of treasurer was vacant. Well, I remembered the nights where I'd been burning the midnight oil as a bond attorney at O'Melveny and Myers, and at 2 a.m. when I was either at the printers with investment bankers or in my office doing documents, actually long before word processing, I said, at that time, because I'd see Jess Unruh's name on all these documents, I bet he's not up. I bet he's at the Torch Club in Sacramento. And I thought, that's a better job. And when he passed away, I thought, gosh, the Office of Treasurer of California is a place where everything that I've done, from school board and building new schools and sewer, public works, building a new clean water, wastewater program system, to being a public finance attorney, this is a place where I could really do something. So it was, again, this passion that pulled me back, and I ran for treasurer, was elected, served during a time other than today when California was in its worst financial difficulties, and thoroughly thought I would run for 2 terms, but again, I have this little risk gene which says if you're passionate and you're feel that things aren't going right, just go for it, and ran for governor after my first term as treasurer, and it was not a good year for Democrats, and I will assure you, if you're thinking about yesterday's or this week's election and thinking about to next year, it is exceedingly difficult to unseat a sitting governor in California, and I took the silver medal in the governor's race that year and slid right back into the private sector, first at Bank of America, where I ran the private bank for 4.5 years, and dealt in sort of the wealth management arena, not wanting to do bonds again, and then left Bank of America in 2000 and joined Goldman Sachs again in the wealth management, investment management area, and about 3 years ago, senior management came to me and asked if I'd leave private wealth management and the side of the financial services business I'd been on since 1994 and come over to the debt side and to public finance and run the public finance group for Goldman, which I accepted. A little curiosity, greed, and ambition motivated me to go back into the world of bonds, and it has been an incredibly energizing, exciting business to be in, because I'm really in the intersection of public policy and of finance. So if you're a deal junkie and a public policy junkie, this business is a really interesting place to be. Intellectually challenging, you can see the difference you make, and you can't help but be involved in the public arena. And there's lots happening in that area today. So that's what I do, that's what I love, and have no desire to go back into politics.
Kevin?
Having just heard Kathleen's story, I'm not so sure about that. But she's next to two former investment bankers, so keep an eye on her. Let me just give you briefly my story, which really pales in comparison to the folks I'm sitting next to. I came out to Stanford from a little town upstate New York, had no interest in politics, didn't really have much of knowledge of too much, had never been out to Stanford. My folks didn't want me to go, didn't let me visit. And I sort of applied without them knowing and found my way taking a big blue super shuttle down Palm Drive as a freshman. And as I saw, it was a beautiful day. The Frisbees were going, and I remember thinking what a smart decision somehow I had made. So I loved it out here, had a great time, and I mean this sort of for better or for worse. Stanford somehow made me a Republican. I didn't come out here as a Republican, but somehow being on this campus for 4 years, I said, maybe I should start to think about politics and think about where my own instincts are. And so I had a great time out here. It was terrific. I had a couple of professors who were not as old and crusty as they might appear today. So
I wonder who that might be.
Brady was actually a sweet, compassionate, kind, loving, very progressive liberal professor back then, and something's happened to him. Let me just tell you guys this. Unlike my two colleagues you're sitting next to me who are in the private sector, because I'm in the public sector currently, the ethics lawyers, before you go on a trip like this, sort of make you jump through all these hoops and fill out papers and forms and the like. And so they have made me say that the words that I'm giving today are clearly my own. They don't represent the Bush administration. And the president's off giving a speech on Veterans Day, so this won't get in the way of that. After having spent 4 years here, I went off to law school again, sort of at the behest of my folks who thought that was a very promising career. And I think my time in the law was really very small, even in comparison to Kathleens. I had worked as a summer associate for 11 weeks, 3 days, and 2 hours, and that was more than enough. And I had seen what the investment bankers were doing during one of those summers at the time that I was a summer associate at a law firm in New York. And I said, that's exactly what I want to do, whatever that was. So I went to Morgan Stanley right after law school. I was a mergers and acquisitions advisor for about 7 years. I had no particular designs, algorithm, I think, as Bob said, about getting back into public service, or from my standpoint, getting into it. I came back to my apartment one day on New Year's Day 2002 and got a call from Larry Lindsay, who was at the time running the National Economic Council at the White House, and he and Andy Card had left successive voicemails that said, quit and come down here and join the administration. So I quit a few days later and have been there for 3.5 years, have had a terrific experience. And I think the only lessons that I would sort of bring to bear to the discussion we're going to have today is, rather than thinking about sort of what's your career plan and how do I get there, I'd say good fortune, good luck is probably more important than any of the rest of those things. I had a great time on Wall Street, was really enjoying it, and I think when I showed up in Washington, unlike some folks who come to Washington, I think with a very open mind in terms of what they'd be interested in, what their skills are, my own sense is the best way to be successful in that realm and in public service is to show up with some knowledge about something. And the something can be incredibly narrow, it could be broad, but I think there's probably too many people that come to Washington in particular that are just smart, good folks who care about the person who they're working for and are just ready to say, sign me up. And I think my own experience on Wall Street at least gave me some area of comparative advantage, some level of competence on an issue that once you're there and you establish your knowledge in a very narrow area, I think it's a lot easier than to sort of move up vertically and move around horizontally. So that's what brought me to Washington, and I'm happy to still be part of the administration.
Our format, we have other questions, and I have listed that I'll ask each person in order, but I think I'll change that. I'll throw the question out, and if you want to say something, we'll just do it in order. So the first question we have is, how have your private sector experiences helped, if they have, your public sector career? And anybody want to take that first? Kathleen?
Yeah, I guess I would say that I don't think the public sector and the private sector are that different. There are a lot of things that are different about it, but at their core, life is about fundraising, politics, and service. You just call it different things. And in the political world, you have to run for office, you go out and raise a lot of money. You are the consummate entrepreneur. And all you're selling is your vision, your ideal, your dream, and then you got to go out and you got to ask money to support that. It's like an IPO or a private equity firm. And so, or if you're in office and you're involved in budget setting, you raise taxes, or if you're or don't raise taxes, cut them. And if you are in the pension area, or if you're sitting on a pension board as a trustee, you're looking to increase your return on investment in your portfolio. So, fundraising is just core to both the sides of the equation, or dealing with budgets. And then the politics side, life is people. And there are plenty of politics in Goldman Sachs, and I suspect there may be some even at Carlisle, and I know that there's some at Stanford. So politics is people, and being able to navigate through the complexities of human nature. And then at the end of the day, whether you're in government or you're in business, I think service is what it's all about. Serving your clients, serving your constituents, serving the public. And so there's this I don't know whether you two have found this, but when I left government and I came over to the private sector, people would come in and go, "What's it like?
What did you do?
What did you do?" It's like a dirty little secret kind of thing. And then my political friends and elected people go, "What's it like inside of a corporation?" And stripping it all away, they're awfully similar at the core. And neither, we all know, is perfect, and I don't think the private sector is as perfect as it sometimes thinks it is. And I know the government sector has greater virtues than a lot of people give it credit for. So that's kind of
Great, thanks.
I think.
You got anything to add?
I would agree with an awful lot of what Kathleen said. First of all, in mentioning the politics in academia, the fact that there are a lot. Henry Kissinger once said, you know, the politics in academia are so intense because the stakes are so small.
They're nasty and brutal.
But Kathleen's last comment, I had the exact same experience. When you go to work in an investment bank and people say you work in the government, and they're like, wow, what was that? What was OMT? And I literally had a Wall Street person come up to me my first week working in Wall Street and say, gee, what was it like to go home at 5 o'clock every day? And if anyone who's ever spent time in the White House, Kevin, I mean, my average departure time for all the years I was in the White House was probably 1 a.m. And you work every Saturday for sure, like, 9 to 7 till it's time to go to your dinner party and talk more politics. And you work like half the Sundays. I mean, so obviously there's a complete disconnect. And so when people ask me about, gee, should I work in politics or whatever, my analysis is everyone should do it for a little while, and no one should do it forever. And I think one of the big problems we actually have in American society is that the people who work in the private sector, in things like investment banking or private equity or venture capital or whatever, they're going to give half of their lifetime earnings stream to the government, just start at that level, and they have no idea, like, what happens to it, what it is, what it does. They just don't even have a clue how it works. And conversely, lots of people who work in the government, a lot of people in Washington, their definition of being in the private sector is when they leave government taking a job as, a lobbyist down the street for a company or a trade association or whatever. And yet, I found, as I said, I actually did public service before being involved in the business world, but I found it to be enormously valuable to your business career, not in like a direct pecuniary way, but from the simple view of giving you a lot of perspective, interesting perspective. And in any job, I mean, I agree at heart with what Kathleen said. The most important thing in life, the interesting thing in life is getting something done, doing something that's meaningful. And you should only do either career if you have an idea, a little different take on what Kevin said. To go into public service, you should go there with a list. I actually made a laminated list when I went into the White House of the 5 things I wanted to accomplish before I left. And I kept it in my top drawer. And when you're sitting there and you have 47,000 things in your inbox and there's 300 unreturned phone calls and you're only going to return 200 of them before you go home at midnight, it helps to say, okay, what am I actually trying to do, and what do you believe in? What are you trying to nail? And I think the same thing applies in business. I mean, truthfully, you should do venture capital. I think is wildly interesting because you meet new people every day, you see great companies, and there's a tremendous public sort of benefit to it. I mean, our little fund, we weren't in the venture capital business till 6 years ago, and now we were 8 different funds, et cetera. But just in the U.S., the little companies that we've invested in, it's only been about 80 or so or 60 companies. They today employ 6,000 people from zero when we started. So that's pretty interesting. But I think that what the sort of crosswalk between the two careers gives you is perspective, which is very valuable in either setting. So when one of the big things that CEOs complain about young, hotshot, slick investment bankers is, why are they telling me how to run my life when they don't, they're 27 and they've only worked in New York and they don't know anything. And in that sense, they actually value people, I think, who were in a political campaign and had all the pressures that come with that, or had to make difficult public policy decisions that were complex, or have met a lot of other CEOs because they're in that world. And conversely, when you're sitting on a board, first of all, if you really take a step back, not just in the public finance world, think of how many sectors of our economy are incredibly highly regulated. If you're a healthcare investor, you sure ought to have a perspective on how the FDA drug approval process works and the FDA medical device approval process works. And if you're going to be an energy investor or a clean technology investor, I mean, pick a sector. Very, very, in almost every one, there are issues that come up every day when you're sitting on a board or being an investor that are related to what some government is doing somewhere. And then I also think the great thing about both sectors can be, but certainly a great thing about politics at the national level, or I'm sure being in the governor's office or whatever, is the number of people just come through the office every day and see you and want to do something, and you get to know them, and then you're out in the business world, and that turns to be pretty valuable. So remember when I came to Robertson, my first week there, my second day, I was sent on a pitch, and in a sector I frankly didn't know that much about, and we were going to carve out a division of Marson Knudsen and take it public, which is a big construction engineering company. Now it's a small construction engineering. I was sort of the available banker at the time, and I had started at a pretty junior level, and they're like, yeah, do we really want to send the junior guy on the pitch here and whatever? And we walked into the board and to make our big presentation, and Peter Ubroth was on the board, and I had known Peter from working in the White House because we did a bunch of things together. He was involved in some volunteer initiatives. And before the board meeting starts, he comes running down from the side of the table where the board is, and gives me a big hug, and we're high-fiving and whatever. And it turns out we won the books on that IPO, and priced it a couple weeks later. At which time people said, "All right, I guess you can stay." But I didn't really think of it, and I wasn't sort of planning for that to happen. But it turns out, you have to learn the underlying business. Once you learn the underlying business, it turns out that the contacts you make on either side are incredibly valuable on the other side, because you tend to run it. Active people who are trying to do something, as Kathleen was sort of aiming at, tend to be involved in both businesses, and you'll meet a lot of them in the public policy world.
Kevin, are there any, other than the lowering of the salary, are there any downsides to moving between public and private careers?
Well, I'll let you know, but 3.5 years into it, I will tell you, it's been a really good experience. And just to echo something that Kathleen said, is I actually think that the worlds are not that different. It turns out that this is all relationship business. Whether you're Bob and you're pitching a piece of business as a young investment banker, or you're running for office, or you're a policy guy trying to think after Katrina, so what do we do to help folks in the Gulf region? It's all about relationships. It's all about who's on your team. I think it's all about feeling as though the folks on your team are all rowing in the same direction that you are. And so I think my own experience in M&A, we all somehow rationalize what we did as sort of the right background, so I'll take my crack. When you're putting together an economic policy and you're trying to move it through the Congress and get it back to the president's desk, it's just like a deal. And you got to know when to call the buyer, when to step back, when to reach out to the board member, when that's going to be an offensive thing to do. And I think that sort of relationship and understanding sort of the ebbs and flows of discussions, you can learn from any background. And I think probably having seen it in the government, it'll be more useful when you go back to the private sector. And I think probably today, more than at any other time, at least that I've been paying attention to these things, it's now clear to folks on all sides of this, whether you're in Washington looking at Wall Street, whether you're in Wall Street, you're looking at Washington, you're out here, that the folks recognize that they don't really know what's going on in the other world, but they know they need to know. And again, that's what I think is sort of the most compelling reason about trying to bridge that divide. The dictionaries are different. Some of the people are different, the personalities are different, but the underlying sort of core thing, what you're trying to do, is really quite similar.
I basically agree, but I think that there's one admonition that I would give, and that is if one goes into the public sector and into politics or government first, and is there for a long period of time, I think that the private sector has a fairly healthy suspicion that public sector individual or politician, may have worked just till 5 p.m. and may not have the energy or may not have the DNA or have what it takes to be a commercial killer and be commercially effective. I think that is...
Or the analytic competence, which is
or,
why it's useful to have an MBA or a law degree.
Or the rigor to be effective. And I would say further that I think if you are a Democrat, that there are stereotypes that will play against you even more. And if you are a Democrat who is also a woman, you have a double stereotype that will work against you. So beware, is all I would say. For me, I didn't start earning real money, as they say, though I think I made real money when I was an associate. It seemed like an absurd amount of money to pay someone who didn't, know too much. That's it. But, coming into, full-time employment, I was 50 years old. And, age can also work against you. So just some admonitions. And that gets back to some of the luck, I think, you mentioned, and good fortune, and finding an area of expertise that will make you valuable if you are going from the public sector to the private sector, or the private sector to the public sector, or vice versa.
I'll just add one thing to that, what Kathleen suggested, which is I also think there's a sort of stereotype if you're a Republican or a Republican male, you go into the public sector first. There's sort of this view, right, that we all learn Republicans go to businesses, they try to make money, and they try to be these successful capitalists. And if you go as a young Republican to Capitol Hill to work for your member, and you stay there for a long time, folks are saying, well, hold on, right? The stereotype holds. Aren't you supposed to be out there sort of helping the government by raising your income? And so I think the same. So I think the same stereotype, which is incorrect, really could work against you. So I think what we're really both saying is go where the opportunities are. Be particularly mobile, particularly early on, because it's easy when you're a young investment banker to have your blinders on, or a young lawyer, just to sort of work through that path, and then you're going to wake up many years later saying, did I really accomplish what I was trying to do?
Yeah.
Okay, that leads, I'm going to skip our question 4 so we can maybe get the audience sorted. But the question is, what advice do you all have for young people in the audience for getting into the public sector? But before I ask, that's in the context of my experience at Stanford and Harvard, where I taught, is that there are a lot of people who want to get into the public sector, particularly MBAs, and they'd all like to start as Secretary of State, perhaps Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and I cannot tell you the number of times I've had conversations with, are you kidding? So the question is, in that specific context, you've all told individual stories, but what sort of advice do you have for people who want to have that? You start at a different level, so general advice. I don't know, Bob, you want to start with that? No?
Yeah, I mean, I'd tell you something. In one sense, I'm completely sort of corny patriot about one thing, which is it is amazing to me, to this day, how open the American sort of public policy process is to anyone who wants to get in and work hard and has an idea. And I would, obviously Dave's question might have been a setup. It really doesn't matter what level you start at. It really doesn't. I would just jump in if you're interested in being involved. I mean, in my case, I was an intern in college in the summers, but I was, a nobody. My father wasn't the governor. And my father actually ran for mayor while I was in college of our little hometown in New Jersey, and that was a valuable experience. Ran his campaign, and we won. You learn how to count votes, which is a good skill to learn. But I think it's amazing to me, and it's true to this day, on any given campaign, if you just sort of jump in and get involved, politics like anything else in life, they're desperate for people that are smart and hardworking and have good ideas. And you can volunteer for a campaign, and I had one of the people who was working for me at Robertson Stevens who years ago who wanted to get involved in politics, and I said, well, why don't you go to Sacramento this weekend and work for some people that are doing stuff for Bush? And then a week later, she went to Austin for the weekend, and 2 weeks later, she was on the paid policy staff And then they won, and then she had a huge job and became an assistant secretary of the Treasury, within 7 months, a year after having had no involvement whatsoever in public life. And so I think don't be afraid to start as a volunteer, and there's a million ways to do that. You can volunteer to write policy stuff. You can just sort of show up at the campaign and volunteer to help on events. Those who are already in business, obviously you can always people will invite you to anything you want to write a check for. But I would also, by the way, make the same advice for people coming out of public life and going into business. Don't be afraid to start at the bottom, because we live in a meritocratic society, which is wonderful. And like when I came out of public life, a lot of my colleagues coming out of senior jobs in the White House were going to meet these investment banks. They'd go to meet Goldman or Morgan or somebody in New York and say, I will only join if you make me a partner. And the partners, after they would leave, would kind of laugh behind their back and say, why on earth would we make someone who has only worked in public life a partner? And but when I came out of the White House, I mean, I had consciously planned a little bit, as per Kathleens' admonition. I had left public life when I was the chief of staff to a governor and gotten an MBA specifically so that I could, have the tools to sort of do what I wanted. But when I came out of the White House, I had a couple offers from corporations, some in New York, and one for this little firm in California. And the offer that I had at Robertson Stevens, my guarantee there in my first year was 1/4 the guarantee of my best offer. I mean, I had an offer that was 4x the money. But I loved the meritocratic feel of Robertson Stevens. I said, how long does it take to make partner here? And they said, it might take 2 weeks and it might take 20 years. Depends whether you're any good. And I just loved that answer. And I liked the youth and the kind of energy and meritocratic nature of the people. So I went to Robertson Stevens, and it worked out, very well. I mean, ended up making partner in 18 months and was on the management committee. And then, as I mentioned, we sold it and everything else. But I could have gone to New York at 4x the initial money, and I'd probably would have been 1/10 the all-in money, after 5 or 10 years of doing it. So I think you have to look for the most interesting opportunity that lights your fire, and frankly, the money will take care of itself if you're competent.
Kathleen?
I go back to what I started with: be passionate and do get involved. I happen to be of the opinion that the most interesting place to be in politics today, if you want to get things done, is in local government and in the mayor's office. Sacramento, they can't agree on what time it is. There's dysfunctional. Washington is pretty much the same thing, though you deal with kind of international, global terrorism, very interesting issues. But if you really want to see what's happening and you want to see government working, as my brother said, Kathleen, when you're mayor, you can't afford not to be a capitalist. And it's true. You they're all right there in your office. You can't hide. There aren't a lot of bodyguards or different hallways to separate you from your people. And you have to pay the bills, and you have to create the jobs, and you've got to deal, with everything from potholes to crime in the streets. So I think that is a really interesting place to get involved. And I totally subscribe to the volunteer, get involved with a campaign or a candidate. Pick someone that you can get excited about, and then I would also say, it used to be in my day, keep the business cards before you had databases, but keep those databases and work them and use them and network.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is I think the folks that are successful, at least that I've seen in Washington government, are folks that are highly principled, and it doesn't matter what your principles are. Folks that come to town because, as Brady says, they want to be Secretary of State, because they want to be powerful and they want to have the fancy car. These are people that inevitably, on both sides, don't thrive and succeed in the long term. Folks that go there because, listen, they very much care about this issue. And there's nothing wrong with, having fun, sort of showing up wherever your office is every day and feeling good about where you go. But the folks, it strikes me, that have been around, that are really successful, that are the closest confidants to leaders in the Congress, to leaders in the administration, are folks that are really sort of key aides that are there because they believe in the person, they believe in the ideas. And so I think part of what you all need to do is think about what is it that really motivates you, whether it's in education or national security. and then really figure out what team you want to work with and go there and do it, and everything else really will take care of itself.
Okay, we're going to turn to the audience. I'll take questions. Yep.
So I guess you could have also called this panel Navigating a Career in Professional Services and Public Service, as there seems to be an inherent fluidity with law firms, with investment banks, private equity shops. Do you think that fluidity exists on the more corporate side as well, or do you think that playing one advisory role to another is inherently an easier transition?
I think there's much less fluidity if you're trying to rise up for, but nobody does anyway, more in America anyway, for 30 years in some company, I mean, we've all seen data, how much more mobile people are in American society today. I would say that there's probably the most similarity between law or Wall Street and politics, because you have, in both cases, a large variety of issues and a large variety of people, and you're constantly sort of juggling the priorities and working with those people and trying to get something done. So I would say, the last thing I would say, I think in a sense it doesn't matter which one you start. I think one of the things to think about as you build a career is where do you start something that gives you skills that creates the most options going forward. And I think in my case I started working in the U.S. Congress. It was an unbelievable, wonderful general education about 59 different things about how the world works. And I think Wall Street is the same way. It's a tremendous sort of general education because you see a lot of different companies and you learn the finance process, and Congress you learn the political process. But they are quite similar in that regard. I've never spent 20 years at Procter & Gamble, so I don't know. But
I agree.
See, none of us know anything else, so it's hard for us to answer.
Yes, you had a question.
Yes, I had a question on a couple of you talked about getting positions from having a phone call and then switched your career. And I was wondering how you got to the position where you did receive that phone call.
Very good. Very good question. I thought he skated over that myself.
I'll take a tackle at it because I guess I brought up the phone call. In spite of the guy at the end of the table here, when I was an undergraduate, I spent a lot of time. I was paying for much of my education out here, and I spent a lot of time trying to find professors who I could do work for, meaning really get paid to do work for. And I found at the Hoover Institute they were paying more than they were in the Department of Economics. And so I spent a lot of time when I was an undergraduate around folks like Brady and John Cogan and George Schultz and Milton Friedman, and it ended up being an incredible educational experience. So I really learned economics more really running back and forth and running Excel spreadsheets for them and asking really dumb undergraduate questions than I did in any of the economics courses or any of my studies subsequently. And I stayed relatively close to those folks, largely still doing work on the side for them when I was in law school, again getting paid and trying to demand a higher wage for my services now that I was no longer at Stanford. When the president, and then Governor Bush was running in 1999, sort of had a decision, well, do you think I should pack up my bags and run down to Austin? And I didn't do that. And I said, well, I'm really interested in Wall Street. I'm going to stick on that path. But there was work and questions that came out of the work they were doing as they were trying to come up with economic policies for the president, then governor. I spent a lot of time just really working on things on the side, joining on a couple of conference calls, not writing any checks because I really wasn't in a position to write too many checks, and was as helpful as I could be. The president was inaugurated, had really still no intentions of coming down. During the first 9-12 months of the president's office, Enron became more than just a company in Texas, but was a major scandal. And as that thing was going, they thought they would want someone who'd spend some time in boardrooms, and so they put that phone call in on New Year's Day.
Okay, can I just make one little comment on that? Two little comments. One is, I think if
About his phone call?
No. Well, if you're in the when you work in the private sector, if you want to get that phone call from the public sector, one way to do it is that kind of volunteer thing at night, volunteer on campaigns, do what Kevin was doing, helping out with economic policy on the weekends, or get involved in nonprofit boards where you meet unbelievable people on these nonprofit boards that you could never meet if you called them up with your business card and said, can I come visit you? The other thing I would say, a little story, be careful when you get the phone call. This actually happened to me when we had won the governor's re-election race in New Jersey for Tom Kean. We won by 1 million votes in a 2-to-1 Democratic state. It's the largest plurality in the history of the state before or since. And so when you're running a governor's office, you get to know the people in the national campaigns. And so after that had happened, there was a little article in the paper, and it said, gee, the governor's aides did a good job. Maybe some of them are going to go to the White House. And that very night, I was sitting at home. It was a Monday night, I remember, because I was watching Monday Night Football in sort of late November, early December. And the phone rang at my home, at my house, and the voice came on and said, Mr. Grady, this is the White House operator. I have Vice President Bush on the line for you. And I actually thought it was my buddy from the governor's office who had been giving me a lot of grief that day about, oh, gee, you showed up in the newspaper, you're going to go to the White House. And I thought it was a big joke, and I thought it was a joke. I thought it was him calling. And I said, yeah, blank you, Todd, blah, blah, blah. And as I said that, Bob, George Bush here. And it was Vice President Bush. Anyway. That was my introduction. I went to work for him anyway.
I actually have a question for Kathleen. I'm wondering, with all the knowledge that you've accumulated in both your private and public sector careers, what is the one thing that you wish you could have told yourself 20 or 30 years ago? Keeping in mind that we're most of your students here.
Just the one.
question.
Yeah. I guess just do it. I think my colleagues on the panel have said, don't worry about, you have to be mindful of consequences, but follow your instincts, follow your gut, and be true to yourself. I think it sounds so cliched, but I think if you overplan and overscript and think you want to be somewhere, it's awfully hard to realize that. And a Jesuit law professor, when I was at Fordham Law School, said something to me that may be that phrase, which I told him I wanted to drop trust in estates because the rule against perpetuity just seemed too mindless for me to get my head around. And he said, Kathleen, you'll do fine. You'll do fine. Just stick it out. He said, and remember, be present where you are. And I thought that was a great piece of advice, to be present where you are and give yourself, that moment. I ended up getting the highest grade in trust and estates, but not doing it for a business. I guess that would be it.
Well, I just want to make one point. That is interesting because I hadn't thought of it until just now. But you get in a lot of discussions with students who come and say, "Well, gee, how can I do this and that?" And they're strategizing. And I just thought not one of them has ever actually gone into the public sector or done anything like that. And the people that I know, they just did it. Mm-hmm. And then they'd be in your office and they'd be saying, "Well, I'm doing this. What do you think?" And you could have an interesting conversation. But I don't have a lot. If I thought thinking about it, just seems to me it's right. That's very important that they just did it. They don't agonize and scheme about it. They just do it, and then they're suddenly in your office talking about how it works, which is so. I think that's an excellent point. Other questions? Yes, sir.
For those of you that went in, for those of us that went into public service because we wanted to help people or we were passionate about one thing, was it hard to go into the private sector? In that, maybe it was improving the bottom line or reporting to the board. Was that disconnect a problem in making the jump?
Bob?
I don't really think so, but I might maybe be a terrible investment banker or venture capitalist because I think that I don't really spend my time thinking about money, if you can believe that or not. And that's not the interesting part of it. It's not what matters. What matters is think about, in my current life, finding companies that are doing really interesting things that you think are going to change the world. By definition, if they're successful, they'll get big and everything will work out. But I don't, no, if anything, I think, you also make a calculus. My personal calculus was when we lost the election, I said, I could have stayed in town and been a lobbyist or this or that. And I was like, get out of Dodge and just do something different. Go do something different. And I do think there's an interesting conundrum, I think, for people that want to change the world. I think there's a live question, to Kathleen's point, where can you best do that? And I think there are, a whole longer discussion. I think there are a lot of things about our political system today and our public policy system that are broken, that people on both sides of the aisle would say, gee, they're frustrating, and some of those are institutional things that can be fixed, and some are cultural. But I don't think, I think the people that are, there's a variation on what Kevin said, I think the people that are successful in the private sector are not people who are sitting there thinking every day, all day about how much they're going to make, or they might be thinking about the bottom line in the sense that it's their job to create value for shareholders as they're building an entity, but they're really thinking about how to do that, how to create value, and how to do something really interesting and meaningful. And so for me, I don't really think it's a big, giant, difficult conflict. No.
I can say for those of us who knew Bob before he got married, you could go in his house, and on several occasions the lights would not go on because he neglected to pay the electricity bill. There would be like 100 bills. So it's true, he didn't think much about it.
Taking a slightly different tack, when I left the office of treasurer, and I had, with the to your exception of O'Melveny, and you might say being a corporate wife, had been primarily in the public sector, and I expected it to be difficult to make that transition, and my phone did not ring with too many offers after the governor's race. I had to create my own opportunity. So what I tried to do is twofold. One, think of industries or businesses or sectors that were in change and in flux, because I believe that if there was something happening in those sectors, there'd be more of an openness to people who had a little bit different background and experience, and there might be a greater opportunity set. And then secondly, I thought about people who knew me, people who had invested in me from my political life and political career, and knew me beyond, television opposition ads, and went to each one of them and lied a little bit, telling them that their sector was the most interesting. And they were a lot of different sectors that I was focusing on, but asked, for their advice. But I prefaced that by saying 4 magic words. I want to make money, 5 words. And I want to build equity, or some fine point on that. I want to build equity. That was before the tech crash. Now, I want to make money would be the more appropriate line. And that got the person on the other side of the desk or the table thinking about me differently. That I had been in the public sector, I had been in politics, but I was going to be commercial. And so those 3 things of looking for opportunity set where there's change and flux. 2, starting with people who know you, trust you, know who you are. And then if you come with my background and sort of the stereotypes of woman, Democrat, brown, saying you wanted to make money, that would change the whole debate. And suddenly there were a lot of opportunities.
Yes.
To what degree does having a law education degree help to advance you in a career, a political career? And conversely, to what degree would it be a detriment not to have a law degree?
I'll take a crack at it. I think the only thing I learned in 3 years of law school is that there's nothing to it, right? The rule of perpetuity is notwithstanding. People that aren't lawyers think that there's this holy script and that only lawyers get indoctrinated in the script. Everyone else has to run to lawyers so that they can find the right page in this massive tome and figure out where the answer to that question is. These legal questions that arise in the policy context, you don't need to be a lawyer to sort of read the legislative language and say, geez, that doesn't make any sense at all. So I think it just gives you sort of an ability to decode or demystify the law. Folks in Washington that aren't lawyers, and it's a very small group of folks that aren't lawyers at some point in their lives and didn't go to law school, try to sort of promulgate this idea that, you know, it's a sort of very secret society, but it's not. So I think if you have a fear and unease about the law, then it's a good 3-year investment just to get you comfortable with it. But if you go into it and say, you know what, you know, I might have no experience in the law, but I can sit down and read anything and figure it out and ask the right questions, then that's a good way to save a little bit of time and a little bit of money.
You can see how Kevin is not a nominee to the Supreme Court. Imagine that person. A law? What's that?
I would take a different point of view. I completely agree about the demystification. I mean, I found out it wasn't, you know, all that mysterious code. But I did think that law school does impart a rigor of analytic thinking. And it does give you over and over and over again the building blocks and the tools to decode problems. And in public life or in business, you're constantly confronted with complexity, different stakeholders, different constituencies, different levels of problem solving. And I personally felt, in spite of my 4 years of Stanford undergraduate education, that my law school education empowered me, gave me tools to not be intimidated by any problem, that you could break it up into its constituent parts and do an analysis. Now, maybe that's what business school does, but I really felt that law school was invaluable, and you didn't have to go practice law.
Hector?
I want to know which part of your advice can be generalized and extrapolated to other settings than the American political setting, like the settings in other countries, Europe, Middle East, or anywhere else in the world? Do you think your advices are unique and constrained to the American setting?
Well, how would we know? I guess what I would say is I've written articles on Europe and studied the Japanese parliament. I mean, it seems to me that somebody made a comment, several people made the comment, smart, hardworking people are in demand anywhere. The question, I guess, is what are the points of entry? And they're probably going to be somewhat different in those countries. And so maybe somebody has something to say. But.
I mean, we invest all over the world. I would say this. I think that the great thing about American society, and one of the things I say to the Stanford MBAs I teach is, you know, this has, at least in the last 30 years, been sort of the most meritocratic society, in my view, ever invented in the history of the earth. And therefore, for people who go to something like Stanford Business School and are at the top of the meritocratic heap, it's a fantastic opportunity. They should literally just think about what they want to do, be true to themselves, and just do it, because people will let them do it here eventually. I think that, and I think increasingly you're seeing the evolution of highly meritocratic and therefore very interesting business cultures in, for example, China and India today, which are amazingly exciting in my view, if you're an entrepreneur or would-be entrepreneur. And I think America is at the same time becoming less exciting because the meritocratic features of our society are slowly being encroached upon. My observation is that the business culture in Europe in the Middle East is a bit more difficult because it does matter a little bit more where you started and who your family is and stuff like that, which in America largely is irrelevant, which is great, I think.
Okay, there.
My experience of working being in both public and private sector, I don't think this is just a British thing, is that decision making can be very different between both directions, what you've learned from decision making in one area and taking it into the other.
Kevin, Kathleen?
Yeah, when I said there were lots of politics at Goldman Sachs or Bank of America or Stanford, I think one of the lessons that you cannot help but learn when you're in politics, and certainly if you run for office, is you have to listen. You have to listen to people, and you can't underestimate them. You have to take their point of view and factor it in to your own decision making and your own strategy. And I think that understanding that and understanding that people matter when you least expect them to matter, which is kind of a respect for people, which again, I think in politics, when you have to go before the voters, it's a humbling experience. Also asking for money is a humbling experience. And I think that really served me well moving into the private sector, because I didn't try and rush ahead and, just know it all. I really found my way through the labyrinth of this, the private sector culture. And it differs. Every business, every company has its own culture. So I think those are great skills to have.
I think decision making is more similar than people would realize. I think that in both segments, it's important to have processes to step back every now and then and plan and think about what are we going to do in the calendar over the next 2 years, whether it's in politics or in business, that are going to make sure we achieve our objectives. But in fact, the reality is, in my view, success is best achieved by making 1,000 good decisions every day. In other words, and you never have total freedom of movement in either place, and there are a million decisions you have to make with imperfect information every time. And if you, in fact, just make the right decision on every little one, and the details do matter, in aggregate, you will move in the right direction and it will work. But I mean, I think it's important to make 1,000 good decisions every day, and when you do, things will work out.
I think this is probably the last. Well, all right, we'll try yours and then yours. But you've got the last question. So make yours short. I'm kidding.
Bob, you mentioned before you had 5% of your goals when you were in the White House. So I was curious if you're willing to share some of those and if you accomplished them, and to the rest of the panel, if you had any particular goals on the table tonight that you'd be willing to share with us.
Yeah, I can remember a couple of them. And one was to, because we had promised in the campaign, and I had written a speech in which we promised it, was to get enacted a Clean Air Act, and we did enact the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which were still on the books today. It's a huge statute, had the first acid rain control program in the history of the country, and an emissions trading program, and a number of other things. One was, I was in the OMB, so one was to try to increase the budget for two things that I cared about, R&D and for the national park system, and at the same time, the only way to do that was to make some progress in trying to reform entitlements. So that was another three things, and we actually did fairly radically increase R&D, domestic spending, as well as added over 1 million acres to the parks. So it's funny, actually, in my case, and this does say why you have to have an objective. Over the Secretary of the Interior, Manuel Lujan at the time from New Mexico, was against the concept of land acquisition by the federal government. And so he would come in with a request for zero for National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera, land acquisition, and I would put in like $250 million for each. And we'd have these appeals in the cabinet room with the president, and the secretary would say, "This is unheard of. I never heard of a budget guy who gives you more than you don't ask for something, he gives it to you instead of cutting what you asked for." I thought his job was to cut, and we said no. Our job is to reflect the president's priorities. I think the other one I'll tell you was interesting, and to everybody's points about being the stereotypes often being wrong. When I'd been in college, when I was at Harvard, I chaired a thing to try to get Harvard in those days to divest its holdings of companies doing business in South Africa. And we succeeded in getting them to sell off their bank stocks, but we didn't get them to sell anything else. And years later, the opportunity arose, and I worked with some people that were then at Princeton, and then we ended up getting a statute passed, signed by a Republican governor, in New Jersey, where we were the first state. We divested, this was in 1984, 5, our entire portfolio of any company, $9 billion, in those days seemed like a lot of money, $9 billion pension fund, any company doing business in South Africa. And so, you can great thing about public life, you can bring those objectives to bear, and you never know, your time will come where you can actually get it done.
Your time has come.
Sorry.
Two-part question to follow on some of the
Two-part?
things that we have discussed.
Sure.
Short parts. One is, sure, if you work hard, you can succeed, but given that I think a lot of us here are MBA students, from the perspective of having worked in the public sector, what does someone with an MBA bring to the table as far as skills go? And second, to follow on another question, again, considering the fluidity between the straight and the government, for those who may not be going into Wall Street, in your experience, what individuals have you met who've worked in the business sector but not, working in finance? Where did they come from by the time they enter, the public service or have a successful career?
Okay, Bob, take the first part. Kathleen.
That's good, because I don't think I understood the second
I
question.
don't understand.
I actually think MBAs are highly valued in the public sector. There's a little bit of a thing where there's so many people that are congressional staffers or even in the White House that haven't worked in business or that don't have an MBA, that it's this black art thing. They think, God, they're, gee, you actually worked in finance or for a company and you have an MBA, you must know something that I, who's just a normal political hack, don't know. And so I actually think MBAs are quite highly valued, certainly from top schools, and so it's a huge plus, I think, as people think about recruiting you to that role. I think,
You're going to have to take a private answer to the second question. So I thank the panel very much.